I'm Beverly Matthews, 68 years old, and I never thought my own children would abandon me at an airport gate. The family vacation to Hawaii I'd paid for with my retirement savings was supposed to reconnect us. Instead, I watched in disbelief as Pamela, Richard, and Tiffany boarded without me, claiming there weren't enough seats. In that moment, something broke inside me, but something stronger emerged. The decision I made next changed everything forever. If you're watching this, drop a comment telling me which airport you've had your worst experience at, and subscribe to hear how I reclaimed my dignity and rewrote my future. My story begins long before that fateful day at the airport. For 40 years, I worked as a dedicated nurse, often pulling double shifts in the emergency room. I loved my career, the patients I helped, and the difference I made. But nothing compared to the love I had for my family. My husband, Walter, and I raised 3 beautiful children together until cancer took him 5 years ago. His death left a void in our family that seemed to grow wider with each passing year. My oldest, Pamela, is 48 and has always been ambitious. Even as a child, she was determined and focused. Now she's a marketing executive at a prestigious firm in Chicago, always glued to her phone and laptop. Our conversations have dwindled to rushed holiday calls and occasional texts about the grandkids. When we do talk, she's distracted, often putting me on speaker while multitasking. "Mom, can you make it quick? I have a meeting in 5 minutes," became her standard greeting. Richard, my 45-year-old middle child, was always the peacemaker. Sensitive and kind as a boy, he grew into a man who avoids conflict at all costs. His wife Vanessa never warmed to me, and over the years, I watched him slowly adopt her opinions, including those about me. Whenever family disagreements arose, Richard would stare at his shoes saying, "Let's not make this a big deal." Even when it was. His accounting job kept him busy, and his priority became pleasing Vanessa rather than maintaining our relationship. Then there's Tiffany, my youngest at 40. Beautiful and spirited. She was the baby we hadn't planned but immediately adored. Walter spoiled her terribly, and after his death, her sense of entitlement only grew. She expected me to babysit her children at a moment's notice, loan money that was never repaid, and accommodate her ever-changing plans. "Mom, you're retired. You have all the time in the world," she'd say dismissively when I occasionally pushed back. What none of them seemed to remember was how their father worked overseas for nearly 7 years when they were young. I raised them largely alone during that time, juggling nursing shifts with school pickups, soccer practices, and science projects. I was both mother and father, nurse and provider. My vacation days were spent chaperoning field trips rather than relaxing. My nights were spent helping with homework rather than sleeping. I remortgaged our house to pay for Pamela's law school before she switched to marketing. I worked weekends for years to cover Richard's college apartment after he lost his scholarship. I delayed my retirement by 3 years to help Tiffany through a difficult divorce and career change. These weren't sacrifices to me then, they were acts of love. But now, I wondered if they had seen them as obligations I was expected to fulfill rather than choices I had made out of love. The pattern of exclusion began subtly. Pamela hosted Thanksgiving 2 years ago but called just 3 days before to say, "Mom, we're keeping it small this year. Just immediate family." Immediate family, it turned out, included her in-laws but not me. Richard forgot my birthday last year, then sent a grocery store bouquet 3 days later with a pre-printed card. Tiffany invited me to her son's high school graduation but called the morning of to say, "There's limited seating, Mom. You understand, right? We'll show you pictures." Each incident stung, but I rationalized them away. They're busy. They're stressed. They don't mean it. Walter would have called me ridiculous for making excuses for them. "Bev," he'd say, "you deserve better." But without him beside me, my confidence in demanding respect had diminished. Last Christmas was particularly difficult. We gathered at Richard's house, and I spent most of the evening in the kitchen, helping Vanessa while everyone else exchanged stories and laughter in the living room. When I brought out the dessert I'd spent 2 days preparing, Tiffany commented, "Oh Mom, we're all trying to cut back on sugar," before accepting a slice of Vanessa's store-bought pie 30 minutes later. That night, alone in my quiet house, I resolved to try one last effort to reconnect with my children. Hawaii had been Walter's and my dream destination, one we had saved for but never experienced due to his illness. I had nearly $15,000 set aside, money I'd been saving for a kitchen renovation. Instead, I decided to use it for a family trip, a chance to rebuild our bonds on a beautiful island. I called each child, explaining my plan to pay for flights, a 3-bedroom condo at a beachfront resort, and even activities. Their responses were lukewarm at best. Pamela checked her calendar before agreeing, asking immediately if the condo had good Wi-Fi. Richard worried about taking time off but eventually agreed after I offered to cover his children's expenses too. Tiffany seemed most enthusiastic, though her first question was whether she could bring her new boyfriend, Cody. The planning fell entirely to me. I researched accommodations, found reasonably priced flights, and created an itinerary that I hoped would please everyone. When I emailed them the details, the responses trickled in with requests for adjustments. Pamela wanted a later departure time. Richard's wife needed gluten-free options researched in advance. Tiffany asked if we could stay at a different, more Instagram-worthy resort. I accommodated every request, reworking plans and stretching my budget further. This will be worth it, I told myself as I submitted the final payments. We'll reconnect as a family. Walter would want this for us. The excitement I felt as the trip approached was genuine. I bought new summer clothes, got a fresh haircut, and even splurged on expensive sunscreen. I printed all the tickets, confirmations, and itineraries, organizing them in a travel folder. I was determined to make this trip perfect, to bridge the growing gap between us. If I could just get them away from their busy lives, perhaps they would remember that they once enjoyed my company. How wrong I was. The morning of our departure, I was packed and ready by 6 a.m., though our flight wasn't until noon. My suitcase sat by the door alongside a tote bag filled with snacks for the grandchildren and magazines for the adults. I'd even tucked in a surprise envelope with spending money for each family, something I knew Walter would have done. The plan was for everyone to meet at my house at 8 a.m., giving us ample time to reach the airport, check in, and navigate security without rushing. By 8:30, no one had arrived. At 8:45, I started making calls. "We're running late, Mom," Pamela said, sounding irritated as if I was the one causing the delay. "Ethan couldn't find his swimsuit. We'll be there soon." Richard's phone went straight to voicemail. Tiffany texted that they had overslept but were literally walking out the door right now. They finally arrived at 9:20, creating a chaotic scene in my driveway. Cars parked haphazardly, children spilled out with partially zipped suitcases, and adults barked orders. No one greeted me properly. Instead, Richard glanced at his watch and announced, "We need to leave now if we're going to make it." Somehow I ended up squeezed into the back row of Pamela's SUV, wedged between two car seats with my travel documents clutched to my chest. My carefully packed tote was relegated to the trunk, deemed too bulky by Vanessa. The drive to the airport was tense, with Pamela repeatedly cursing at traffic while her husband Gerald gave unnecessary directions from the passenger seat. Upon arrival, I distributed the printed boarding passes I'd prepared. Tiffany immediately complained that she hadn't been assigned a window seat. Richard barely glanced at his before stuffing it into his pocket. Pamela checked hers and frowned. "Mom, you should have done online check-in. These seats aren't together." The confirmation email said our seats were assigned at booking, I explained. "I printed these last night." Pamela rolled her eyes. "Whatever. Let's just get through security." The security line stretched longer than expected. My children and their families moved ahead, while I struggled to remove my shoes with my artificial hip, making it difficult to bend. No one waited. By the time I made it through the scanner, they were already putting their shoes back on and gathering their belongings. "Mom, come on," Tiffany called, bouncing impatiently on her toes. At the gate, we discovered the flight was overbooked. The gate agent, Patricia, a woman about my age with kind eyes and silver-rimmed glasses, made an announcement requesting volunteers to take a later flight in exchange for travel vouchers. "Looks like we have a situation," she explained when I approached the desk to ask about our seats. "The reservation system is showing only 5 seats confirmed for your party of 6. I turned to explain this to my children, who had gathered in a tight circle several feet away. As I approached, their conversation stopped abruptly. I recognized the look they exchanged, the same one they'd shared as teenagers when conspiring to break curfew. "There's a problem with our reservation," I said. They only have 5 confirmed seats. Pamela's expression shifted from annoyance to something resembling relief. Well, that's unfortunate, she said in her business voice. But we need to find a solution. They huddled again, excluding me from their discussion. I stood awkwardly to the side, watching as they spoke in hushed tones, occasionally glancing in my direction. Finally, Pamela stepped forward, clearly elected as the spokesperson. Mom, she began, her tone sickeningly sweet. We've discussed it and we think you should take the next flight. The words didn't register immediately. Excuse me. It makes the most sense, Richard jumped in, looking anywhere but at my face. The kids need consistency in their schedules. You know how they get when they're overtired. And you're good at traveling alone, Tiffany added brightly. Remember when you flew to Aunt Clara's funeral by yourself? Pamela nodded. It's just logical. The next flight is only 3 hours later. You'll still arrive this evening, and we'll have the rental cars ready when you land. I stood there, stunned into silence. The background noise of the busy airport seemed to fade as I processed what was happening. My own children were choosing to leave me behind. Not one of them had offered to stay with me or suggested drawing straws or any other fair solution. I see, was all I could manage to say, my voice distant even to my own ears. They took my muted response as agreement. Richard patted my shoulder awkwardly. We'll make sure your bag gets checked through to the next flight. Pamela was already on her phone. I'll email you the condo details so you can get in if we're at dinner when you arrive. Tiffany, at least, had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. We'll save you some dinner. Hawaiian food is supposed to be amazing. Within minutes, they were gathering their carry-ons and herding children toward the boarding line. Not one of them looked back as they handed their boarding passes to Patricia. I watched as they disappeared down the jetway, feeling as if I were observing strangers rather than the children I had raised. Left alone at the gate, I sank into a vinyl chair, my printed boarding pass crumpled in my hand. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall in public. The humiliation was overwhelming. I felt invisible, discarded like an inconvenient piece of luggage. All those years of putting them first, of organizing my life around their needs and wants, had led to this moment. They had weighed the situation and unanimously decided I was the expendable one. The realization was a physical pain in my chest, as if Walter's wedding ring, which I wore on a chain around my neck, had suddenly become unbearably heavy. Around me, the airport continued its normal rhythm. Travelers rushed to gates, announcements echoed overhead, and reunions played out at arrival doors. Normal life continuing while mine had just been shattered in the most unexpected way. I don't know how long I sat there, staring blankly at the boarding pass in my hand. It might have been minutes or an hour. Time seemed irrelevant in the face of such betrayal. Mom? Are you all right? Patricia, the gate agent, stood before me, concern evident in her face. She had stepped away from her post to check on me, a small kindness that nearly broke my composure. My family, I began then stopped, unable to articulate the truth without breaking down. There was a seating issue. Patricia nodded, her eyes revealing she had witnessed the entire scene. Your family boarded already, she said gently. They mentioned you would be taking the later flight. The matter-of-fact way she stated this, as if it were a normal occurrence for elderly mothers to be abandoned at airports by their children, finally broke through my shock. A single tear escaped despite my best efforts. Patricia sat in the chair beside me, lowering her voice. The thing is, Mrs. Matthews, there actually is one seat left on this flight. In first class. Patricia's words hung in the air between us. One first-class seat? I repeated, uncertain I had heard correctly. She nodded, her silver earrings catching the fluorescent airport lighting. It's available, but it's not covered by your current economy ticket. There would be an upgrade fee of $800. $800. Nearly a month's worth of grocery money. Money that could go toward property taxes or the leaking roof I'd been putting off fixing. A frivolous expense that Walter would have deemed unnecessary. But then, Walter hadn't lived to see his children abandon their mother at an airport gate. It became available when a business traveler rebooked, Patricia continued, her voice low as if sharing a secret. I normally wouldn't mention it, but... She trailed off, glancing in the direction my children had disappeared. I knew what she had witnessed. The huddle that excluded me. The quick decision that I was the expendable family member. The way not one of them looked back as they boarded. Patricia had seen it all from her position at the gate, and her sympathetic expression told me she found their behavior as appalling as I did. "Is your credit card chip or swipe?" she asked, as if my decision had already been made. Perhaps it had been. In that moment something shifted inside me, a tectonic movement of my internal landscape. The hurt was still there, raw and pulsing, but alongside it grew something new and unfamiliar. Indignation. I deserved better than this. I deserved better than them. "Chip," I said, reaching for my wallet. "And I'd like to pay for priority boarding as well." Patricia's smile was conspiratorial as she processed my payment. The retirement credit card I rarely use felt unusually heavy in my hand. I had been saving it for emergencies and somehow this qualified. This was an emergency of self-worth. "Here you are, Mrs. Matthews," Patricia said, handing me a new boarding pass. "Seat 2A. Window seat in first class. We'll begin boarding in 20 minutes, and you'll be in the first group." I thanked her, clutching the boarding pass like a talisman. In the restroom, I splashed cold water on my face and reapplied lipstick, studying my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me appeared older than I usually felt, with lines of hurt etched around her mouth. But my eyes held something new. Determination, perhaps. Or simply the clarity that comes from having illusion stripped away. When the boarding announcement came, I walked to the priority line with my head high. The flight attendant at the jet bridge welcomed me with a warm, "Right this way, Ms. Matthews." And for the first time that day, I felt like a person of value. The first-class cabin was a different world from the economy section I was accustomed to. Wide leather seats with actual legroom. Flight attendants offering pre-departure beverages and hot towels. The noise and chaos of economy boarding happening behind a literal curtain. And then I saw them, my family, making their way down the aisle toward economy. Pamela first, efficiently directing her husband and children where to stow their belongings. Then Richard and Vanessa, awkwardly navigating the narrow aisle with their twins. Finally, Tiffany and Cody, already complaining about the lack of overhead space. None of them looked toward first class. Why would they? I was supposed to be sitting alone at the gate, waiting for the next flight, conveniently removed from their vacation plans. The moment Pamela glanced up and saw me was one I will savor forever. Her step faltered, her mouth forming a perfect O of surprise. She nudged Richard, who looked up with similar shock. Tiffany actually stopped in the aisle, causing a minor traffic jam as other passengers tried to move around her. I merely sipped my complimentary champagne and turned to gaze out the window. My seatmate, a distinguished gentleman named Marcus who looked to be in his 60s, noticed the small drama playing out. "Friends of yours?" he asked discreetly. "My children," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "They decided there weren't enough seats for all of us, so they suggested I take a later flight." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Yet here you are." "Yet here I am," I agreed, lifting my champagne flute in a small toast to myself. As the plane took off, I felt lighter than I had in years, despite the grief and anger still simmering beneath the surface. Marcus turned out to be a delightful conversation partner, a widower himself who owned a chain of furniture stores in California. "Family can be complicated," he shared after I gave him an abbreviated version of the day's events. My brother's children expected to inherit his vacation home when he passed, even though they visited him maybe once a year. When he left it to his housekeeper who had cared for him daily for a decade, they were outraged. "What happened?" I asked, genuinely curious. "He had the foresight to make his wishes legally binding," Marcus said. "The best thing we can do for entitled relatives is set clear boundaries." Boundaries. The word resonated in a way it never had before. For years, I had operated without them, believing that maternal love meant infinite accommodation. In the comfortable quiet of first class, with actual room to think, I began to see how my lack of boundaries had contributed to my children's behavior. I had never required respect. I had never insisted on reciprocity. I had never shown them that my needs and feelings mattered too. Instead, I had taught them that mother was always available, always giving, always putting herself last. and they had learned that lesson perfectly. The 5-hour flight to Hawaii became an unexpected gift, a bubble of time where I could reflect without interruption. I ordered a meal I enjoyed without having to consider anyone else's preferences. I watched a film I chose without negotiation. Small pleasures that highlighted how accustomed I had become to compromise. Midway through the flight, I opened the notebook I always carried and began to write. Not the usual grocery lists or grandchildren sizes, but my genuine feelings about what had happened. The words flowed freely, some angry, some hurt, all honest in a way I rarely allowed myself to be. By the time the captain announced our initial descent into Honolulu, I had filled several pages and reached a decision. This moment, this betrayal would mark a turning point. I would no longer accept being an afterthought in my children's lives. I would no longer fund their disrespect with my retirement savings. I would no longer silence my own needs to accommodate their convenience. My phone, switched to airplane mode during the flight, displayed multiple texts when I turned it back on after landing. Mom, where are you? Did you make the earlier flight? Pamela, we're at baggage claim. Text when you land. Richard, OMG Mom, we saw you in first class. How? Tiffany. I put the phone back in my purse without responding. Patricia's words hung in the air between us. One first-class seat? I repeated, uncertain I had heard correctly. She nodded, her silver earrings catching the fluorescent airport lighting. It's available, but it's not covered by your current economy ticket. There would be an upgrade fee of $800. $800. Nearly a month's worth of grocery money. Money that could go toward property taxes or the leaking roof I'd been putting off fixing. A frivolous expense that Walter would have deemed unnecessary. But then, Walter hadn't lived to see his children abandon their mother at an airport gate. It became available when a business traveler rebooked, Patricia continued, her voice low as if sharing a secret. I normally wouldn't mention it, but... She trailed off, glancing in the direction my children had disappeared. I knew what she had witnessed. The huddle that excluded me. The quick decision that I was the expendable family member. The way not one of them looked back as they boarded. Patricia had seen it all from her position at the gate, and her sympathetic expression told me she found their behavior as appalling as I did. Is your credit card chip or swipe? She asked, as if my decision had already been made. Perhaps it had been. In that moment something shifted inside me, a tectonic movement of my internal landscape. The hurt was still there, raw and pulsing, but alongside it grew something new and unfamiliar. Indignation. I deserved better than this. I deserved better than them. Chip, I said, reaching for my wallet. And I'd like to pay for priority boarding as well. Patricia's smile was conspiratorial as she processed my payment. The retirement credit card I rarely use felt unusually heavy in my hand. I had been saving it for emergencies and somehow this qualified. This was an emergency of self-worth. Here you are, Mrs. Matthews, Patricia said, handing me a new boarding pass. Seat 2A. Window seat in first class. We'll begin boarding in 20 minutes, and you'll be in the first group. I thanked her, clutching the boarding pass like a talisman. In the restroom I splashed cold water on my face and reapplied lipstick, studying my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me appeared older than I usually felt, with lines of hurt etched around her mouth. But her eyes, my eyes, held something new. Determination, perhaps. Or simply the clarity that comes from having illusion stripped away. When the boarding announcement came, I walked to the priority line with my head high. The flight attendant at the jet bridge welcomed me with a warm, "Right this way, Ms. Matthews." And for the first time that day, I felt like a person of value. The first-class cabin was a different world from the economy section I was accustomed to. Wide leather seats with actual legroom. Flight attendants offering pre-departure beverages and hot towels. The noise and chaos of economy boarding happening behind a literal curtain. And then I saw them, my family, making their way down the aisle toward economy. Pamela first, efficiently directing her husband and children where to stow their belongings. Then Richard and Vanessa, awkwardly navigating the narrow aisle with their twins. Finally, Tiffany and Cody, already complaining about the lack of overhead space. None of them looked toward first class. Why would they? I was supposed to be sitting alone at the gate, waiting for the next flight, conveniently removed from their vacation plans. The moment Pamela glanced up and saw me was one I will savor forever. Her step faltered, her mouth forming a perfect O of surprise. She nudged Richard, who looked up with similar shock. Tiffany actually stopped in the aisle, causing a minor traffic jam as other passengers tried to move around her. I merely sipped my complimentary champagne and turned to gaze out the window. My seatmate, a distinguished gentleman named Marcus who looked to be in his 60s, noticed the small drama playing out. "Friends of yours?" he asked discreetly. "My children," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "They decided there weren't enough seats for all of us, so they suggested I take a later flight." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Yet here you are." "Yet here I am," I agreed, lifting my champagne flute in a small toast to myself. As the plane took off, I felt lighter than I had in years, despite the grief and anger still simmering beneath the surface. Marcus turned out to be a delightful conversation partner, a widower himself who owned a chain of furniture stores in California. "Family can be complicated," he shared after I gave him an abbreviated version of the day's events. My brother's children expected to inherit his vacation home when he passed, even though they visited him maybe once a year. When he left it to his housekeeper who had cared for him daily for a decade, they were outraged. "What happened?" I asked, genuinely curious. "He had the foresight to make his wishes legally binding," Marcus said. "The best thing we can do for entitled relatives is set clear boundaries." Boundaries. The word resonated in a way it never had before. For years I had operated without them, believing that maternal love meant infinite accommodation. In the comfortable quiet of first class with actual room to think, I began to see how my lack of boundaries had contributed to my children's behavior. I had never required respect. I had never insisted on reciprocity. I had never shown them that my needs and feelings mattered too. Instead, I had taught them that mother was always available, always giving, always putting herself last. And they had learned that lesson perfectly. The 5-hour flight to Hawaii became an unexpected gift, a bubble of time where I could reflect without interruption. I ordered a meal I enjoyed without having to consider anyone else's preferences. I watched a film I chose without negotiation. Small pleasures that highlighted how accustomed I had become to compromise. Midway through the flight, I opened the notebook I always carried and began to write. Not the usual grocery lists or grandchildren sizes, but my genuine feelings about what had happened. The words flowed freely, some angry, some hurt, all honest in a way I rarely allowed myself to be. By the time the captain announced our initial descent into Honolulu, I had filled several pages and reached a decision. This moment, this betrayal would mark a turning point. I would no longer accept being an afterthought in my children's lives. I would no longer fund their disrespect with my retirement savings. I would no longer silence my own needs to accommodate their convenience. My phone, switched to airplane mode during the flight, displayed multiple texts when I turned it back on after landing. "Mom, where are you? Did you make the earlier flight?" "Pamela, we're at baggage claim. Text when you land." "Richard, OMG Mom, we saw you in first class." "How?" "Tiffany." I put the phone back in my purse without responding. The next morning I woke to sunlight streaming through gauzy curtains and the distant sound of waves. For a moment, I forgot the previous day's events, aware only of the unfamiliar comfort of the plush hotel bed. Then reality returned, not with the crushing weight I might have expected, but with a strange sense of possibility. I ordered room service breakfast and ate on the balcony, watching early morning surfers navigate the waves. My phone showed more missed calls and texts from my children, their messages growing increasingly concerned or indignant, depending on the sender. I responded with a brief, factual text. "I'm fine. Enjoying my accommodations. We'll be in touch later." Instead of immediately making plans to rejoin my family, I consulted the hotel concierge about activities. She suggested a sunrise yoga class on the beach, followed by a guided tour of native Hawaiian plants in the hotel's historic gardens. Both were activities my family would have vetoed as boring or a waste of valuable beach time. The yoga class was gentle enough for my artificial hip, but challenging enough to leave me feeling accomplished. The garden tour, led by a native Hawaiian elder named Kailani, provided fascinating insights into traditional medicinal plants and cultural practices. When Kailani invited participants to craft a small lei from sustainable garden materials, I created one that would have delighted my younger self, the art teacher I had been before nursing school. By midday, I had experienced more of Hawaii than I likely would have in several days with my family, whose vacation style typically involves sleeping late and lounging by the pool while checking their phones. At Diana's suggestion, I met her friend Lawrence for lunch at a small restaurant away from the tourist areas. Lawrence Ikeda was a thoughtful man in his early 60s who listened carefully as I explained my situation, occasionally making notes on a small pad. "Your financial position is actually stronger than you may realize," he said after asking several detailed questions about my assets. "The house is fully paid off, your pension is solid, and your investments have performed well. The inheritance from your husband was wisely managed." "Walter was always good with money," I acknowledged. "But I've been worried about healthcare costs as I age." Lawrence nodded. "A valid concern. But even accounting for that, you're in a position to make some adjustments to your estate planning if you wish." He explained various options: trusts with specific conditions, donations to charities that mattered to me, even setting aside funds for my grandchildren's education that would bypass their parents' control. "Many of my clients discover that revising their estate plans provides peace of mind and clarity," Lawrence said. "It's not about punishing anyone. It's about aligning your legacy with your values." My initial hesitation about changing long-standing plans gradually gave way to a sense of empowerment. For decades, I had operated under the assumption that my sole purpose was to support my children, that their needs always came before mine. Now, facing the reality of their disregard, I began to consider a different approach. "I'd like to think about this," I told Lawrence. "It's a significant change." "Of course," he agreed, handing me his card. "Take your time. But remember, having a plan gives you options, not obligations." That afternoon, I indulged in a spa treatment at the hotel, another experience my children would have dismissed as a wasteful expense. As the massage therapist worked on muscles tense from years of accommodating others, I reflected on decades of putting my children's needs before my own. I had canceled a pottery class I loved because Tiffany needed last-minute babysitting. I had skipped my best friend's retirement party because Pamela had a work crisis and needed emotional support by phone. I had spent my vacation time helping Richard move rather than taking the painting retreat I had saved for. Individual instances of sacrifice were part of being a parent, but the pattern had become so entrenched that I had lost sight of my own desires and needs. Somewhere along the way, I had taught my children that I existed solely to serve their convenience. My phone buzzed repeatedly throughout the day, with increasingly frantic texts from my children. "Pamela, Mom, this silent treatment is extremely immature. We need to discuss this like adults." "Richard, please call us, Mom. Everyone's upset, and it's affecting the kids' vacation." "Tiffany, OMG, Mom, are you seriously staying at the Royal Hawaiian? That place is amazing. Can we come see your suite?" I responded only once in the late afternoon. "I'm well and enjoying some time to myself. I'll meet you all for dinner tomorrow evening at Orchids. 7 p.m. The restaurant I chose was upscale but not pretentious, located in the Halekulani Hotel with a stunning view of Diamond Head. I made the reservation for 7 people, assuming Cody would accompany Tiffany, and requested a table with an ocean view. The following day, I continued my solo exploration of Oahu, joining a small group tour to the North Shore. Our guide, Malia, shared stories of Hawaiian history and culture that fascinated me. The other tour participants, mostly retirees like myself, were friendly and engaging, asking questions about my life without the undercurrent of judgment I often felt from my children. By late afternoon, as I prepared for dinner with my family, I felt a strange combination of dread and determination. I selected a coral-colored dress I had purchased specifically for the trip, paired with comfortable but elegant sandals. I styled my hair with more care than usual and applied makeup that enhanced rather than tried to disguise my age. The woman in the mirror looked different somehow. More present. More certain. I arrived at the restaurant 20 minutes early, selecting a table that would allow me to observe my family's approach. I ordered a glass of white wine and watched the sunset paint the sky in spectacular shades of orange and pink. They arrived as a group 5 minutes late, scanning the restaurant with expressions that ranged from annoyance to nervousness. I raised my hand slightly to catch their attention, observing their reaction as they approached. Pamela led the way, her business casual attire suggesting she had dressed for a negotiation rather than a family dinner. Richard followed with Vanessa, both looking uncomfortable. Tiffany and Cody brought up the rear, her eyes widening as she took in the upscale setting. "Mom," Pamela began as they reached the table, her tone carefully modulated. "I'm glad you agreed to meet. We were concerned." "Were you?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Please sit down. I've taken the liberty of ordering a bottle of champagne for the table." The unexpected gesture seemed to throw them off balance. They arranged themselves awkwardly around the table, the normal family dynamics temporarily disrupted by uncertainty. "This place is super fancy," Tiffany stage whispered, examining the menu prices with wide eyes. "It comes highly recommended," I replied. "I thought we deserved a special dinner." The champagne arrived, and after it was poured, an uncomfortable silence descended. Normally, I would have rushed to fill it, asking questions about their day or commenting on the menu. Instead, I sipped my champagne and waited. Richard broke first. "Mom, about what happened at the airport?" "Yes," I prompted when he trailed off. "We may have handled it poorly," he admitted, studying his champagne flute rather than meeting my eyes. "May have." I raised an eyebrow. Pamela interjected, clearly uncomfortable with Richard's approach. "What Richard is trying to say is that we made a decision under pressure. It wasn't ideal, but it wasn't intentionally hurtful." "I see," I said. "And would you have made the same decision if it had been one of you rather than me?" The question hung in the air unanswered, which was answer enough. Throughout dinner, I maintained a pleasant but detached demeanor, responding to their attempts to resume normal conversation patterns without allowing myself to be drawn into the familiar role of eager listener and validator. I asked about their day, but didn't effusively approve their choices. I acknowledged their complaints about the condo's Wi-Fi without offering to call the property manager myself. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. For perhaps the first time, I was participating in family dinner as an individual rather than as a supporting character in their lives. When dessert was offered, I declined. "I have an early excursion tomorrow," I explained, placing my napkin beside my plate. "The Sunrise Volcano Tour leaves at 5 a.m. "Volcano tour?" Tiffany wrinkled her nose. "That sounds boring." "I'm looking forward to it," I replied simply, signaling for the check. "Mom, wait," Pamela said, reaching for her purse. "Let us get dinner. It's the least we can do." I shook my head. "No need. I've already arranged to charge it to my room account." I signed the bill with a generous tip. "Enjoy the rest of your evening. I'll be in touch tomorrow." As I walked away from the table, I heard Tiffany's whispered, "What is happening with Mom?" and felt a small satisfaction that they were finally asking the right question. The following days established a new pattern. I spent mornings on adventures of my choosing: the volcano tour, a waterfall hike suitable for my fitness level, a cultural workshop on traditional lei making. Afternoons were often spent by the hotel pool or on the beach, sometimes alone, sometimes with new acquaintances from my morning activities. Diana joined me frequently, introducing me to her circle of friends who welcomed me warmly. Among them was Catherine, a retired judge who had reinvented herself as a painter in her 60s, and Thomas, a widower who taught surfing to seniors at a gentle beach away from the tourist crowds. My interactions with my children became increasingly strained. Pamela sent formal texts suggesting family activities that I sometimes accepted, sometimes declined. Richard called daily, his tone walking a line between concern and appeasement. Tiffany oscillated between resentful distance and sudden overtures of affection, once showing up at my hotel with a cheap souvenir, and the transparent request to see my awesome suite. I maintained friendly but firm boundaries. When I did join family activities, I arrived and departed on my own schedule. I declined to babysit while the parents went for cocktails. I expressed preferences about restaurants and excursions rather than automatically deferring to others. Their confusion was evident. The mother who had always accommodated, always yielded, always put herself last had vanished, replaced by a woman with opinions and boundaries. They didn't quite know what to make of it. Midway through the week, I met again with Lawrence, having given serious thought to his suggestions about estate planning. He had drawn up preliminary documents based on our previous conversation, outlining several options. "I've been thinking about your suggestion regarding charitable donations," I told him. "Walter and I always supported the children's hospital where I worked. I'd like to establish a significant bequest in our names." Lawrence nodded approvingly. "That's completely doable. We can structure it as a named endowment if you prefer." We discussed various arrangements. A trust for the grandchildren's education that would mature when they reached college age, donations to several charities, and a revised distribution of remaining assets that reflected my current relationship with each child, rather than an automatic equal split. "Are you sure about these conditions?" Lawrence asked, referring to specific behavioral requirements I had outlined for Tiffany to receive her full inheritance. "Yes," I said firmly. "I won't fund the same disrespect and entitlement after my death that I've experienced in life." By the end of our meeting, I had signed several documents and scheduled a follow-up with Lawrence's colleague in my hometown to finalize the arrangements. The process was both somber and liberating, like setting down a heavy suitcase I had carried for too long. As our vacation neared its end, I decided it was time for a final conversation with my children. I invited them to a family meeting at a small restaurant near their condo, neutral territory that would allow me to leave when I chose. I selected a table on the outdoor patio, arriving early to collect my thoughts. The ocean breeze carried the scent of plumeria, and the setting sun cast a golden light that softened the edges of the world. It was beautiful, peaceful, and entirely at odds with the difficult conversation to come. They arrived together, as if they had coordinated beforehand, perhaps discussing strategy. Their expressions ranged from wary to defensive as they took their seats. "Thank you for coming," I began. "I wanted to talk with you before we return home." "Mom," Pamela interrupted, clearly having appointed herself spokesperson again. "Before you start, we want to say we're sorry about what happened at the airport. It was poorly handled." Her corporate apology, more acknowledgement of bad optics than genuine remorse, confirmed I was making the right decision. "The airport incident wasn't an isolated event," I said calmly. "It was the culmination of a pattern that's been developing for years. A pattern where my feelings and needs are consistently treated as less important than everyone else's." "You're overreacting as usual," Pamela sighed. "One bad decision doesn't erase everything we do for you." "What exactly do you do for me, Pamela?" I asked, genuinely curious. "When was the last time you called just to check on me, not to ask for babysitting or complain about your job?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again, unable to produce an example. "We thought you were fine with how things were," Richard offered, his default conflict avoidance in full force. "You never said anything." "That's true," I acknowledged. "I never insisted on being treated with basic courtesy and respect. That was my mistake and I'm correcting it now. By punishing us with the silent treatment and spending ridiculous amounts of money?" Tiffany asked, her voice rising dramatically. "How could you ruin our vacation like this?" "This isn't about punishment," I said firmly. "This is about establishing boundaries I should have set long ago. And for the record, how exactly did I ruin your vacation? You had the condo as planned. You had the rental cars. You had all the advantages of a paid vacation in Hawaii." Tiffany had no response beyond a sulky shrug. "While we're here," I continued, "I should inform you that I've made some changes to my financial arrangements." That got their full attention. Richard sat up straighter. Pamela's eyes narrowed slightly. Tiffany stopped examining her manicure. "I've revised my will and established several trusts," I explained. "A significant portion of my estate will now go to charities that were important to your father and me. The grandchildren will be provided for through education trusts that mature when they reach college age." "What about us?" Tiffany blurted, then flushed when she realized how revealing the question was. "You'll each receive a portion of the remaining assets," I said evenly, "though not in equal shares, and in some cases with conditions attached." "Conditions?" Pamela's business voice had acquired a sharp edge. "What kind of conditions?" "Ones that reflect my values and the kind of relationship I expect moving forward," I replied. My attorney has the details. This is ridiculous, Pamela snapped, her careful facade cracking. You can't just change everything because of one incident. It wasn't one incident, I corrected her. It was the moment I finally saw clearly what our relationship had become. And yes, I can change everything. That's my right. So that's it? Richard asked, looking genuinely distressed. You're just cutting us off because we made one mistake. I'm not cutting anyone off, I clarified. I'm establishing expectations for how I deserve to be treated. How we move forward is up to each of you. Tiffany stood abruptly, tears streaming down her face in what I recognized as her standard dramatic exit strategy. I can't believe you're doing this to us. After everything we've done for you. She stormed away from the table, Cody trailing awkwardly behind her after shooting me an apologetic glance. Pamela gathered her purse, her movements precise and controlled. This conversation isn't productive right now. We can discuss this when everyone's calmer. After she left, Richard remained, staring at his hands folded on the table. Mom, he said finally, his voice quiet. I'm sorry. Really sorry. For what specifically? I asked not unkindly. For not standing up for you. At the airport and a lot of other times. He glanced up, his expression reminding me of the sensitive boy he had once been. Vanessa can be difficult. I got used to keeping the peace at any cost. I understand that instinct, I said, reaching across to touch his hand briefly. But peace at any cost usually means someone is paying too high a price. He nodded, eyes suspiciously bright. I don't want to lose you, Mom. You haven't lost me, Richard. But our relationship needs to change. After he left to rejoin the others, I sat alone, watching the last light fade from the sky. The conversation had gone largely as I expected, each child reacting true to form. Yet I felt no satisfaction in being right, only a quiet determination to maintain the boundaries I had finally established. The next day, I changed my flight to return home a day early, leaving a note for each child at the condo's front desk. The message was simple. I love you. I always will. But love without respect isn't enough. I'm ready for a new chapter in our relationship whenever you are. On the flight home, I upgraded to first class again, no longer seeing it as an extravagance but as a statement of self-worth. The woman who had arrived in Hawaii as an afterthought was returning home as the author of her own story. 6 months passed, bringing changes both subtle and profound. My house, once a shrine to family memories and Walter's preferences, gradually transformed to reflect my own tastes. The dark leather sofa Walter had insisted was practical gave way to a blue velvet one that brightened the living room. The formal dining room I had maintained for family gatherings that rarely happened anymore became a light-filled art studio. I enrolled in a watercolor class at the community center, rediscovering a passion for painting I had abandoned decades ago, to focus on practical matters. My first completed work, a sunset inspired by my time in Hawaii, now hung in the entryway, a daily reminder of my turning point. A hiking group for seniors provided both exercise and companionship, introducing me to women with similar life experiences who became valued friends. Volunteering at the Children's Hospital where I had once worked connected me to my nursing roots while allowing me to set my own schedule. My relationships with my children evolved in different ways, each finding their own path to the new reality. Pamela maintained a professional politeness, our interactions governed by an unspoken agreement to avoid deeper issues. We met occasionally for lunch, conversation limited to safe topics like the weather and neutral family news. She never directly addressed the changes to my will, though I occasionally caught her eyeing my new purchases with calculated assessment. Richard made the most genuine effort to rebuild our relationship. His weekly calls became a fixture in my schedule, and I noticed he made a point of asking about my activities and actually listening to the answers. At Christmas, he surprised me by visiting without Vanessa, a 2-day trip that allowed for honest conversations about the past and hopes for the future. I showed Vanessa the door, he confided during that visit. Not divorce, at least not yet, but counseling is a requirement if we're going to stay together. I realized I couldn't keep disappearing into her shadow. Tiffany remained the most resistant to change, her initial resentment hardening into a cold distance punctuated by occasional demands. When these weren't automatically met, she would retreat again, using access to her children as leverage. It was painful but predictable, and I maintained consistent boundaries despite the emotional cost. Interestingly, my relationships with my grandchildren actually improved. Without their parents as gatekeepers, the older ones began contacting me directly. Emily, Richard's 16-year-old daughter, started visiting after school once a week, ostensibly for help with history homework, but increasingly for conversations about colleges and careers. Pamela's son Ethan, now in middle school, called regularly to share his latest science project discoveries. The healing process wasn't linear. There were days when doubt crept in, when I questioned whether I had overreacted or been too harsh. The ingrained habit of prioritizing my children's feelings over my own was difficult to break. But each time I found myself weakening, I remembered standing alone at that airport gate, watching them board without a backward glance. Diana visited from Hawaii in spring, staying in my guest room for a week that felt like a college reunion. "You look 10 years younger," she observed on her first night. "Setting boundaries agrees with you." "It's still hard sometimes," I admitted. "There's so much guilt programmed into motherhood." "Guilt is just fear wearing a mask of virtue," Diana said wisely. "You're not betraying anyone by expecting basic respect." Thanksgiving approached with the traditional expectation of gathering at my house, an arrangement I had never questioned before. This year I sent a group text in early November. "Happy to host Thanksgiving with the following arrangements. Dinner at 4 p.m. Everyone brings a dish. Everyone helps clean up." Confirmation required by November 15th. The responses were revealing. Pamela: "We'll confirm calendar availability shortly." Richard: "Count us in. What can we bring?" Tiffany: "Do we have to bring something? I'm super busy that week." When the day arrived, I felt a nervous anticipation. The table was set with my good china, the turkey was roasting, and my contribution of sides was prepared. The house was clean but not frantically so, as I had accepted Diana's wisdom that no one notices the baseboards but you, Bev. Pamela arrived precisely on time with a store-bought but high-quality pie and a subdued husband. Richard and his family came next, bearing homemade rolls and a green bean casserole, his daughters immediately offering to help set the table. Tiffany arrived 20 minutes late with a half-empty bottle of wine and no apology for the tardiness. The difference from previous gatherings was subtle but significant. When I asked for help carrying dishes to the table, people actually stood up. When I mentioned I needed to sit down to rest my hip, no one expected me to continue serving. When conversation veered toward divisive topics, I gently but firmly redirected it, a small assertion of authority in my own home. After dinner, as Richard and his daughters washed dishes, a sight I couldn't recall ever seeing before, Pamela approached me in the living room. "The house looks different," she observed, glancing around at the changes. "It's very Thank you," I said, choosing to take it as a compliment regardless of how it was intended. "Mom," she began, then paused, visibly struggling with uncharacteristic uncertainty. "I've been thinking about what happened in Hawaii. I didn't handle it well." "No," I agreed, neither accusatory nor mollifying. "My therapist says I have control issues," she continued, the admission clearly difficult. "And that I probably learned to see you as an extension of myself rather than as your own person." "That sounds insightful," I said, genuinely surprised by her self-reflection. "I'm not good at this," she admitted, apologizing, admitting I was wrong. "But I am sorry, Mom. For the airport and for a lot of things before that." "Thank you," I said simply. "That means a lot to me." It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation with tears and hugs. Pamela wasn't built for that kind of emotional display, and neither was I. But it was an honest moment between two women finding their way to a new understanding. As my family prepared to leave that evening, I noticed another small but meaningful change. Each person asked permission before taking leftovers. They thanked me specifically for hosting. They made plans for the next visit rather than assuming my availability. These were basic courtesies that should have been standard all along, yet their presence now felt like victory. Later, alone in my peaceful house, I sat in my art studio with a cup of tea, watching the moon rise over the backyard Walter and I had tended together for decades. I thought about how he would view the changes in our family dynamics, In our home. In me. You finally stood up for yourself, Bev. I could almost hear him say. About damn time. The journey from that airport gate to this moment had been challenging and often painful. I had lost the comforting illusion that sacrifice alone could guarantee loving relationships. I had faced the reality that my children were flawed adults capable of thoughtless cruelty. I had acknowledged my own role in enabling their behavior. But I had gained something precious, self-respect. The knowledge that my needs and feelings mattered. The freedom to create boundaries and expect them to be honored. The courage to shape my remaining years according to my own desires rather than others' expectations. It wasn't about the money, though that had been the catalyst for their attention. It wasn't about punishment, though consequences were a necessary part of change. It was about creating a life centered on mutual respect, rather than one-sided accommodation. I still loved my children deeply, with the complex, enduring love of a mother who had carried them beneath her heart. But I had learned that love without boundaries becomes a burden rather than a blessing, for both the giver and the receiver. As I looked toward the future, I felt a sense of possibility I hadn't experienced in years. Perhaps I would take that painting retreat in Santa Fe I had always wanted to try. Maybe I would visit Diana in Hawaii again, this time staying as long as I wished. The choices were mine to make. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members who took you for granted? Drop a comment below sharing your experience. Sometimes the hardest part of self-respect is believing we deserve it in the first place. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more journeys of self-discovery and renewal. Remember, it's never too late to rewrite the rules of your relationships. Thank you for listening, and may you find the courage to honor your own worth today.